So I want to welcome everyone to the Draft Environmental Assessment public meeting as it pertains to the deactivated SM-1A nuclear power plant for the decommissioning and dismantlement at Fort Greely, Alaska. So the purpose of tonight's meeting, USACE is proposing to decommission and dismantle the deactivated SM-1A reactor at Fort Greely. This public meeting is being held during the 30-day public comment period to provide opportunities for the public to learn about and comment on the proposed action in accordance with the National Environmental Policy Act. We'll be referring to that as NEPA. Substantial comments and feedback from the public received during the NEPA process will be addressed in the final EA as appropriate. So before we start tonight, I'd like to welcome Lieutenant Colonel Johnson to say some brief opening remarks.
Stand here, is that okay? Yeah, that's fine. I'll try to speak in the microphone so everybody can hear me. Hey, everybody, Lieutenant Colonel Johnson, Garrison Commander at Fort Greely. First, I want to say thanks for welcoming not only me, but also Ms. Brenda Barber and her team here tonight to talk about the SM-1A and where we currently stand in the long-term project to decommission and dismantle it. I want to thank everybody who came here in person. Hopefully you find this informative. I want to thank everybody who's attending virtually as well. The key piece about tonight, again, as it has been since the beginning, is transparency, just making sure everybody has a chance to know what's going on with the SM-1A there on Fort Greely, because it doesn't just affect Fort Greely, it affects the entirety of the Delta community, so we just want to make sure everybody has the information that they might want to know about what's going on. So thanks, as always, to Brenda and her team for their support to Fort Greely and this ongoing project. And I know you're not here to hear me talk, so I'll turn it back over to Ms. Barber. But thank you very much.
So thank you, sir. So I want to welcome you all again to this evening's meeting. So I'm Brenda Barber. I'm the Deactivated Nuclear Power Plant Program Manager from the Baltimore District. We will be partnering with the Alaska District. We have several representatives here as well tonight as part of our team. So we're going to walk you through tonight's topics, and we hope that you guys have some feedback and comments. So tonight's topics, we're going to go through a brief history of the SM-1A. We're going to discuss the National Environmental Policy Act. We're going to go over the proposed action to include the purpose and need, the alternatives that we reviewed, and resources analyzed as part of the environmental assessment. We're going to present the draft environmental assessment findings, and then we're going to talk about the National Historic Preservation Act, which we refer to as Section 106. And then we're going to discuss public involvement, how you can become involved, how you can be part of the process. So we will be hosting questions throughout the entire meeting. So if you have a question, please go ahead and interrupt me, and we'll address your question so you don't forget at the end. And then there's also question opportunities at the end of each topic, and then again at the end of the presentation. For those of you that are joining us virtually, welcome. In order for you to ask a comment, you'll need to type in the chat function. Your comment, we'll read it aloud, and then we'll answer your question accordingly. So we're going to move into topic one. We're going to talk about the brief history of the SM-1A. So just for situational awareness, I know you guys are probably familiar with this, located on Fort Greely, approximately 5 miles outside of Delta Junction, 100 miles to Fairbanks, 263 miles to Valdez, 328 miles to Anchorage, and approximately 386 miles from Whittier. This is just an aerial overview of Fort Greely, where the SM-1A is located in the interior of the installation as it pertains to Allen Army Airfield and the 49th Missile Defense Battalion. So we wanted to acclimate you to the affected areas of the SM-1A. So the photo that you see on my left, I guess, yeah, my right, is the Building 606, which is where the SM-1A operations took place. All the SM-1A operations were confined to the north end of Building 606, as well as Building 607, which is an old Quonset hut that we refer to as J5. So all of those affected areas are highlighted in the orange. The pop-out picture to the side indicates the wells that were associated with the original operation of the facility. So well 11 is inside the fence perimeter. We'll be removing that, as well as well 12 and 13, which were associated with the original operation. And so those pipelines and subsurface or surface features will be removed, and then the wells will be abandoned in place in accordance with ADEC regulations. Moving on to some of the operating history. So the Corps of Engineers, in conjunction with several contractors, built SM-1A between 1958 and 1962. And it was designed, constructed, and operated as part of the Army Nuclear Power Plant Program. It was a joint DoD effort. And so this was an Army installation, obviously, but there were several other reactors fielded for all of the DoD entities, to include the Navy and the Air Force. This was a single loop, 20 megawatt pressurized water reactor system. We did use highly enriched uranium dioxide fuel to generate the electrical power for the installation, as well as steam that was utilized on the installation. The reactor was operational from 1962 until 1972. During that time frame, we only had to change the core 4 times, as opposed to the logistics of daily fuel that are needed for conventional power plants. Primary purpose was to use this as an in-service test facility to understand how a nuclear reactor would operate in an Arctic environment. In 1972, the facility was no longer needed. Proof of concept had been established, and so the facility went into final shutdown. At that time, the facility underwent initial deactivation, which allowed us to place the facility in what we refer to as safe storage, which allows us to maintain and monitor the facility while the radioactivity decays over time. And we'll be talking about that in more detail later. During the safe store operations, our period, we do regular inspections and monitoring. That is completed by our team, and we do that in accordance with Army Regulation 50-7 under a possession permit that's issued to us by the Army. So Building 606, north and south, do contain all the infrastructure for the Fort Greely conventional utility systems, and those are owned and operated by DOIN, and so we're working closely with them as a stakeholder as well. Just a quick timeline of events. As I said, the facility was constructed in 58, operational until March of 72. It underwent its initial deactivation from 72 to 73. In the 97 to 99 timeframe, Fort Greely was placed on the BRAC list, and because of the impending BRAC at that time, the Army did move in, and we did an initial removal of the Jarvis Creek discharge line. And so that portion of the work was completed under a record of decision, and so there's no additional cleanup associated with that discharge line at this time. So our team will be focusing on the rest of the reactor site. In 2008, the USACE team came up and prepared a historical site assessment. So we looked at the history of the site, the history of the operations, and prepared a formal report. And then in 2014, we were at the site again to do characterization survey work, to look at the radiological contamination that was still present at the site, which allowed us in 2018 to issue our decommissioning planning contract, which is underway now. By the end of 2021, we will finalize all of our decommissioning planning to include the environmental assessment, and we will utilize those documents to submit to the Army Reactor Office our readiness to proceed with the project, and they will issue us a decommissioning permit. And then 2020, we will award the large decommissioning contract for the site. At this point, we anticipate project completion to be done in 2028. So any questions on the very quick and brief history of the site? Yes, sir.
It sounds as you're definitely going to do it. I thought one of the options is to leave it in place.
So we'll be discussing the alternatives, and so there is a no action alternative, and this is opportunity to receive feedback from the public on the alternatives that we've presented. Our proposed action is to do one thing, but there are other alternatives that we'll discuss, and we welcome you to comment and provide your feedback on that. Any other questions? So we'll move into topic 2. I want to review the National Environmental Policy Act with you briefly. So the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, NEPA, establishes the national policy for the environment. NEPA does require federal agencies to analyze environmental and socioeconomic impacts of their proposed actions. And NEPA requires opportunity for public involvement to learn about and comment on federal proposed actions. So as we discussed, the reason we're here, USACE is preparing an environmental assessment to analyze the potential impacts for the proposed decommissioning, which is our proposed action. The EA is a concise public document that provides sufficient evidence and analysis for determining whether to prepare an environmental impact statement. The EA includes discussions of purpose and need, alternatives to our proposal, environmental and social economic impacts of the proposed action and any alternatives, and a listing of all agencies and persons consulted during the process. So some of the key regulations that we looked at for NEPA, and this is not all-inclusive, Clean Water Act, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, Section 438 of the Energy Independence and Security Act, Clean Air Act, Migratory Bird Treaty, National Historic Preservation Act, Archaeological Resources Protection Act, and various other regulations were analyzed as part of the environmental assessment. So again, just another brief timeline, 73 to present. We've been actively monitoring the site while it's in safe store. In the 2000s, we did develop our all-hazard assessment to start our planning efforts, historical site assessment in 2018. We've done a wide variety of characterization and field efforts in the site, starting in 2010, 2012, 2014, 2019, 2020. And that is allowing us to prepare not only the environmental assessment, but what we call our decommissioning plan, which is the plan that we present to the Army to demonstrate our readiness. As I indicated, the EA will be finalized this year. We're anticipating that we will have a signed EA by June of 2021. Our permit will be issued later in 21 of this year, probably end of year. And then we will award our decommissioning contract in 22. So any questions on NEPA?
So it's a given that you're not doing any EIS?
We are not doing an EIS. And you'll see when we discuss the draft findings that there wasn't anything that results in an effort that requires an environmental impact statement. Any other questions?
Do you know about how many jobs it would create through the contracts?
So we're anticipating about 10 of us will move up from the Corps between the Baltimore District and the Corps of Engineers. And then we will be hiring a contractor who will do the bulk of the work. We're anticipating up to 80 people at any given time. And so that would all be either local or from the lower 48, depending upon the area of expertise that that crew would need to have. Any other questions? Okay. We will move into topic 3, and we will discuss the proposed action for the site. So the proposed action is to complete the decommissioning and dismantlement of the SM-1A in accordance with a decommissioning plan approved by the Army Reactor Office, who is our regulator. We plan to terminate the Army-issued SM-1A decommissioning permit, and then we will release the site for unrestricted use in accordance with U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission regulations adopted by the Army. Again, the proposed action is anticipated to take approximately 6 years. So we want to talk about the purpose of the proposed action. So the purpose of the proposed action is to safely remove, transport, and dispose of all materials and equipment, structures, and residual contamination associated with the SM-1A, release the SM-1A site for unrestricted use in accordance with the radiological dose criteria established by the NRC and adopted by the Army, and to terminate the Army-issued SM-1A decommissioning permit. The need for the proposed action, we need to complete the decommissioning of the SM-1A site within 60 years, which is 2032. of the permanent cessation of operations in accordance with NRC regulations and Army Regulation 50-7. And that is the intent of the Army, is to follow the NRC guidelines. So the biggest driver here is a regulatory requirement. As we've discussed, the SM-1A has been maintained in safe storage condition and subject to regular inspection since 1972. In its current condition, the SM-1A does not support the Army's mission on Fort Greely now or in the future. The proposed action would enable USACE to meet the Army's mission objectives to decommission SM-1A, terminate the SM-1A decommissioning permit, and release the underlying land for unrestricted use. So the draft EA alternatives, the proposed action alternative is to implement the proposed action that we just discussed. It does meet the purpose and need, and following completion, there would be no remnants of SM-1A remaining at the site. We did look at a no action alternative. Under the no action alternative, we would continue to maintain the site in safe store. This alternative does not meet the purpose and need. It is included as a comparative baseline in accordance with 40 CFR 1502.14. We did look at several other alternatives which are documented in the draft environmental assessment. They were dismissed because they did not meet the purpose and need as well. And so we're not going to review those in detail tonight, but they are documented for you in the environmental assessment. So some of the key resources that we analyzed in the draft environmental assessment, we looked at cultural resources, we looked at water resources, socioeconomic and environmental justice resources, biological resources, air quality, transportation and traffic, utilities, soil, waste, safety and health, and then we looked at any cumulative effects from our project as well as other activities that are being done on Fort Greely at this time. We did not look at the following resources because they were not being affected in a meaningful or measurable way. So we didn't look at airspace, land use, noise, recreation, seismology, geology and topography, wetlands and floodplains, rare, threatened, or endangered species, and visual resources. So any questions on the proposed action? So we'll move into topic 4. So we want to discuss with you the draft environmental assessment findings. So the proposed action at this time, we've demonstrated that there's no significant adverse impact on the environment. Under the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106, the proposed action does have an adverse effect on the SM-1A historic property, which is eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. In order to mitigate that adverse effect, we will execute an MOA, a Memorandum of Agreement between the Corps of Engineers, the Alaska State Historic Preservation Office, and participating consulting parties to ensure that the adverse effects remain less than significant. In order to proactively address any adverse effects from the proposed action, USACE plans to comply with applicable federal, state, and local regulatory and permitting requirements, and we will adhere to best management practices and other applicable measures identified in the draft environmental assessment. So from a cultural resources perspective, we do anticipate long-term but less than significant adverse effect on the historic property through the removal of the SM-1A, which, as I indicated, is eligible for listing on the National Register for Historic Preservation. We don't anticipate any effects on archaeological resources at the site. And from a Section 106 determination, the adverse effect on the National Register for Historical Property eligible is a historic property, and so there has been that determination made by the State Historic Preservation Office. So our best management practices, again, are to establish a memorandum of agreement with the Alaska State Historic Preservation Office as well as consulting parties, And we will be following Fort Greely's unanticipated discoveries plan in case we do come upon some type of archaeological resource that hasn't been previously identified at the site. So from a water resources perspective, there's some short-term, but again, less than significant adverse impacts from sedimentation through the removal of some of the soils on site, as well as any potential accidental spills throughout the project duration. We don't anticipate any long-term impacts on surface water bodies or water quality in the area. And we do anticipate some beneficial long-term effects on the stormwater management once the site is restored, as well as on the groundwater at the facility once all the inactive wells have been removed and closed in accordance with ADEC regulations. So from a best management perspective, we will utilize a construction general permit for any stormwater discharges at the site. We will have a site-specific stormwater pollution prevention plan. We will have a site-specific liquid effluent monitoring plan, and we will ensure that there is spill containment and cleanup kits at the site throughout the duration of the project. So from a socioeconomic and environmental justice perspective, we do anticipate short-term beneficial effects on the local economy. As I said, we will have a large crew moving into the area to implement the project, so they'll be staying in local lodging, they'll be shopping in Delta, there'll be a fixture here for that 6-year time frame. There's no short-term or long-term adverse impacts on environmental justice communities or children living either on base or off base, and we don't anticipate any long-term impacts from the project. So best management practices are to continue our public engagement with the local communities. We do maintain information on our project website, and Fort Greely shares that with you guys as well, and so we want to continue to be very transparent from a communication perspective. And then we'll adhere to the other best management practices that we discussed throughout the evening to minimize impact on the installation as well as the nearby communities. So from a biological resources impacts, there's potential for short-term but less than significant adverse impact on vegetation during the temporary disturbances at the site, on wildlife from temporary disturbances, displacement, or annoyances from our decommissioning activities on the site, and an elevated risk of collision with decommissioning-related traffic. Again, we don't anticipate any long-term impacts on the biological resources in the local area. Our best management practices will be to prevent or minimize introduction or spread of any invasive species or plants. We will use wildlife spotters or escort vehicles during all on-post transportation activities as necessary. And we will continue to coordinate with Fort Greely to address any active Migratory Bird Treaty Act protectedness if they are on the SM-1A site, which they are currently not. From an air quality perspective, we do anticipate, again, some short-term but less than significant impacts from potential emissions of fugitive dust and criteria pollutants from the decommissioning-related equipment and vehicles. We don't anticipate any long-term impacts from the project on air quality. From a best management practices perspective, we will be directly loading all of our waste for transport. We do not plan to stockpile any waste at the site. Everything will be containerized before it leaves the site. Transport waste, all the waste transported will be in closed containers. Any material that we're moving in or out that's not waste related will be covered. We will plan to spray the roads to do some dust control as the weather allows. And then when we do have to bring in backfill, we will be stockpiling those materials on site adjacent to the facility, and so we will make sure that they're covered and sprayed with water, again, from a dust perspective. Yes?
So air pollution would be my biggest concern about the thing. When you open this up and expose it, and we get a dust plume that we often have that come completely over the whole community. So is it going to be tinted, the whole excavation area, so that you're not exposing dust to the air? Or how do you manage that?
all the reactor components are in what we call the vapor containment structure. So there's photos in the back on some of the posters if you have a chance. It's a large cylindrical structure that's part of the site. We plan to do all of the work that we can within containment under negative air with HEPA filtration running at all times. And once all of the radioactive contamination has been cleared from those areas, then we'll slowly start to bring those structures down. Depending upon site conditions and the radiological surveys that we do throughout the process, that work may be done under a tent as well. And that's going to be based on conditions that we see as we move through the process.
Will you monitor downwind?
We actually have an environmental monitoring plan. So we'll have monitoring at the perimeter. We'll have monitoring at all of our work locations. And that'll be done on a daily basis. And then we publish those reports and we make those available. So if we need to do downwind, we can do downwind, but we usually catch it at the perimeter. And so that is our intent.
Why wouldn't you do downwind?
We can do downwind. I don't have the plan yet, so obviously when we work with a contractor, we'll develop those plans. And so our first line of defense is our perimeter security fencing. And that's where our initial sampling is done.
We would have multiple air samplers in different compass locations so that if the wind shifts, there'd always be a downwind sampler.
Yeah, that's what I was.
Yeah, that's what we will have that. We just don't have the specific locations, but there's always multiple stations because wind changes.
Any other questions on that topic? Okay. So from a utilities perspective, there is some short-term, but again, less than significant adverse impacts because this facility is co-located with the active central heating and power plant. We will work closely with Doyen to move them out of the affected area so that they're not in our project area and we're not in their workspace. Any short-term interruptions to utilities will be coordinated with Fort Greely, make sure that there's no impact. And we've designed that utility separation work ahead of the decommissioning work so that our project site is completely isolated and we don't have any impact on the utilities for the installation. So again, best management practices coordinate all of that in advance. And then we're going to sequence and stagger any utility shutoffs or disruptions to ensure that it doesn't interfere with the operations on the installation. From a soil resources perspective, we do anticipate some short-term, again, less than significant adverse impacts from disturbance of the soils as well as the excavation activities that are required to implement the decommissioning and dismantlement activities. From a long-term perspective, there are beneficial effects in that all of the contaminated soils associated with the former reactor operations will be removed from the site, and the site will be cleaned to unrestricted release. So from a best management perspective, again, we will have a site-specific stormwater pollution prevention plan to minimize soil mitigation and sedimentation of any receiving water bodies. We plan to replace all the excavated soils with clean fill, meeting applicable Fort Greely requirements. We will have an environmental monitoring plan for the site. In addition to that, we will have a final status survey plan, which is a plan developed by our health physicists to ensure that we have met the requirements for unrestricted release of all the soils at the site. And then once the site is clear for backfill, we will backfill the site and replace the site with native grasses. So from a waste perspective, we do anticipate short-term, again, less than significant adverse impacts from the generation and management of radioactive and non-radioactive waste. We don't anticipate any long-term impacts from the radioactive or non-radioactive waste. And again, we have some long-term beneficial effects in that the removal and disposal of the radioactive waste at the site will have a long-term positive impact on the installation. So from a best management perspective, we will have a hazardous material abatement plan, a waste management and disposal plan, We plan to manage and dispose of waste in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements. We will have a spill prevention, control, and countermeasures plan. And again, spill containment and cleanup kits throughout the site for the duration of the project. So from a safety and health perspective, again, some short-term but less than significant adverse impacts from the increased risk of worker exposure or injury during decommissioning and dismantling activities. And again, long-term beneficial effects in that removal of the radioactive waste and the non-radioactive regulated solid waste from the installation. Those items will be removed, and so from a health and safety perspective, that benefits the installation and the surrounding community. So from a best management perspective, we will have a considerable amount of plans. So we'll have an industrial safety program. We will have an accident prevention plan developed in accordance with our Engineer Manual 385-1-1, which is the USACE safety manual. We will have a waste management and disposal plan. We are coordinating with fire and emergency services, both on base and off base, and that will be done to ensure preparedness at the site in case there is some type of medical emergency or other type of hazardous emergency. We do minimize radiological exposures in accordance with Engineer Manual 385-1-80, which is our radiation protection manual. We will have a radiation safety program and a radiation protection plan. We will conduct environmental monitoring at the site for the duration of the project. And we will, again, have those established memorandums of agreement with fire and emergency response services to demonstrate preparedness to the Army Reactor Office. So from a transportation and traffic perspective, we do anticipate some short-term, again, less than significant adverse impacts due to some increased related traffic from the transport of waste on and off the site. Short-term, but again, less than significant adverse impacts during the transport. As I indicated, all waste will be packaged and transported in accordance with the applicable NRC, US DOT, International Maritime Dangerous Goods Act, US EPA, and the State of Alaska requirements. We do anticipate short-term but less than significant adverse impacts on marine ports and shipping. We don't anticipate any short-term adverse impacts on the freight rail transport network. And then there's no long-term impacts from the transportation perspective once the project is complete. So from a best management perspective, we do plan to use trained and qualified contractors to transport our waste. We will have a transportation management plan for all transport that is completed on post, and then we will have a separate transportation plan for everything when it's prepared to leave the base. We plan to schedule our decommissioning-related traffic for off-peak hours, and then we will package and ship all waste in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements. So any questions on those initial draft EA findings?
I kept seeing there's long-term beneficial effects of like removing the waste and stuff, but they found that there's long-term negative effects. Like, has it been negatively affecting our groundwater?
No, there's no impacts to the groundwater on the installation. So your aquifer is about 300 to 400 feet deep. And so we've tested the groundwater, and we tested the water under the vapor containment structure. We've never seen anything in the groundwater on the installation. But we will be verifying again as part of our departure from the site that there are no impacts to soils or groundwater or any of the media on the project site.
So you're going to put all these containers on trucks here and drive them to Fairbanks, one of the biggest cities in our state. You're going to take them off trucks and put them on a train and run them all the way down to Anchorage through our state, and then take them off the train and put them on ships in Anchorage, and you don't anticipate any problems there.
So you just did my next two slides for me, so thank you very much. So in order to answer your question, can we go through these slides and we'll continue to discuss that? So we do have some specialized topics that we wanted to discuss with you. One of the key ones is waste transportation. We do anticipate and acknowledge that logistics, moving waste out of the state of Alaska, is going to be a challenge for our team. So anything non-hazardous that's a solid waste will be directly loaded in containers and potentially be disposed of in the state of Alaska in accordance with ADEC regulations. Very little waste from our project can be disposed in the state of Alaska, unfortunately. And so a majority of our waste will be shipped to the lower 48. And as you indicated, it will go by truck, train, and vessel. And again, it will be transported by licensed and qualified contractors in accordance with NRC, USDOT, International Maritime Dangerous Goods, EPA, and the State of Alaska regulatory and permit requirements. So at this time, our plan is just as you explained, and this is obviously subject to input from future bidders and from our selected contractor. We plan to truck materials from Fort Greely to Fairbanks. In Fairbanks, we plan to load those materials onto rail cars. Then we'll go by train to either the Port of Whittier or the Port of Alaska, where it'll be loaded onto a vessel. Sorry, excuse me. And then from there, it will be shipped to the Port of Seattle on the West Coast, at which point it would then be loaded again onto preferably rail and go to the disposal facilities, which our preferred disposal facility is in Texas. It's in Andrews County, Texas, which is near Odessa and Midland. Rail transport is the safest transport. That's been looked at by the NRC. So they've issued a generic environmental impact statement with regards to shipping waste associated with decommissioning activities, and they found that to be the safest approach as opposed to the other rail, truck, vessel. And so we are preferring rail at this time. We have shipped via barge. We've got other materials. We had a nuclear reactor on a vessel, and so the team is very familiar with that. But yes, the logistics will be a huge portion of this project, and we plan to take that very, very seriously. So with that being said, at this time, we're anticipating up to twice weekly shipments from Fort Greely. Could be less, could be more, but on average, it'll probably be 1 to 2 trucks per week. It's a 6-hour round trip.
They're going to empty the containers in Fairbanks and bring them back?
That's just filled or empty. If they will return containers to us as well. So it's an inbound and outbound. So when we send container, no. The disposal companies will have to send us empty containers as well. So they will come up in a very similar fashion as they go down with waste. Yes, once we seal a waste container, it will go all the way to the disposal facility. It will not be reopened until it arrives at the disposal facility. But we need new containers, so they will come back in a similar fashion. So rail shipments from Fairbanks to the Port of Whittier or the Port of Alaska, there are 2 weekly shipments available, so depending upon how much waste we have ready to go on rail, we would pick one of those shipments, and then that would be a 1-day duration from Fairbanks to one of the ports. And then depending upon the port, both of the ports offer a weekly service down to the West Coast. They either depart on a Wednesday or a Friday. It's a 13-day one-way trip, and then it would be inbound into the West Coast ports and go by rail from there. So does that answer your question? So another key component of this is we will require our contractors to have an emergency response contractor on call at all times. And so if there were some type of accident while in transit, it is their sole responsibility to respond. But again, a key thing to keep in mind, there is no radioactive fuel, there's no radioactive liquid. These are activated reactor components that are left at the site. And so if there were to be an accident, it would be very localized and very minimal. I'm not discounting it, I'm just explaining. I've been doing this for 25 years, and I know how old I am. I've never had an accident of anything inbound in shipment. Never. I don't know. Yeah. It's not to say that it can't happen, but it's very low risk. There's minimal. We tried to get as much of it, based on what we've been told. The waste storage tanks, they've been filled with grout.
Yeah, we don't anticipate.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no record that there would be, but you know. But we don't anticipate it.
Did someone else have a question? Okay. So does that answer your question fully? Your wife. Okay. Go on. So another key topic that we wanted to just make sure everyone was aware of and comfortable with is radiation safety. So as I indicated, the site has been in safe store for over 40 years. The primary reason that we did that was we wanted to allow for radioactive decay at the site. So we have two key isotopes remaining at the site. One is cobalt-60, which is a gamma emitting isotope, and it has a half-life of 5.27 years. So as you can see with the red line, the cobalt-60 has decayed away, and so that's the occupational safety risk for our workers. And so being in a safe store, that has allowed that cobalt-60 to decay, and so no longer represents a significant occupational health and safety risk for us. The nickel-63 is a low-energy beta emitter, and so it has a half-life of over 100 years. And so you can see with the green line there, the nickel-63 is still present and has not decayed away. That's a concern for the disposal facilities, and so that is a requirement for the disposal facilities to monitor and maintain all of our waste in perpetuity. And so we just wanted to make sure that you guys understand the radioactive decay that has occurred at the site. So again, some more radiation safety topics. There is minimal risk to the public from the SM-1A project. The SM-1A reactor pressure vessel contains no nuclear fuel. All the fuel was removed from 72 to 73 and into that initial part of 74. Everything was returned to the Department of Energy at that time. The safe store period has allowed for the radioactive materials to remain restricted and allowed them to decay so that we can avoid exposure to our workers during the decommissioning activities. We do have a very highly skilled team of engineers, radiological health physicists, scientists, and contractors who will use proven techniques to implement this project. This is our third one, so this is not our guinea pig. We already did that. We are doing the sister facility at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, right now. So our team is down there now, or at least part of our team is down there. And so by the time we get to Fort Greely, we will have all the lessons learned from the prior reactor sites. And we actively continue to implement those lessons learned. So safety is the #1 priority for USACE. And that not only includes the safety of our workers, but the safety of the tenants on base, those living and residing on base, and the community surrounding the installation. So this quick radiation chart, there's two key items on here I want to point out for you. The average annual radiation dose to the public, on average, when you go about your daily business, going out, working, eating, everything that you do, you are exposed to approximately 620 millirem of radiation in a year, just as your day-to-day activities, sun, medical x-rays, those types of activities. Our release criteria, our cleanup goal for the site is to clean up the site to 25 millirem. And so we just wanted to point those key things out to you and make sure that you have a comfort level from a radiation safety perspective. So any questions on the draft EA findings or the waste or the radiation safety?
Where did the fuel go? You said it was turned over to the department.
Went back to Savannah River at Oak Ridge. Any other questions?
On your earlier slide, you were looking at two different isotopes.
Uh-huh.
When we did the wasteline removal, we were looking at, I think, cesium-137 and strontium-90. Why are we looking at different isotopes?
There's a lot more isotopes. Those are the primary ones.
Those are the ones.
That are inside the container. So yeah, we have cesium-137. We have
Any other questions? Okay. So we're going to move into topic number 5. Topic number 5 covers the National Historic Preservation Act, which we refer to as Section 106. So the Section 106 process for the proposed action is being conducted in parallel with the NEPA process. So USACE is the lead federal agency for Section 106 consultation as it pertains to the proposed action for the site. Under Section 106, we have determined that the SM-1A is eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. And it's also a contributing resource to the National Register of Historic Places. There's a historic district located on Fort Greely, so it is a contributing resource to that historic district on base. So the first picture indicates Building 606, or the SM-1A site, in the blue. That's the area of potential effect for the project as it pertains to our proposed action. And then, as I indicated, the yellow boundary there represents the historic district of Fort Greely. And so by removing the SM-1A, we're having an adverse effect not only on our resource, but the historic district associated with the installation. So under Section 106, as I said, we will have an effect on both the historic property and the historic district. And so we plan to resolve this adverse effect by executing a memorandum of agreement and participating with consulting parties to get their input on the process. And then the memorandum of agreement will require us to meet those stipulations. So what we plan to do is do a site marker, hopefully, for the site. I know we're going to donate one to you, Mary, and then one will go to the installation. So those will be made available, and if other parties have an interest, we'll be doing that. We'll also be doing historic engineer and architect record, which basically will be a documentation of the design, the operation of the site, and then as well a complete record of all of our activities at the site. We like to take a lot of pictures and do a lot of videos, so there'll be a lot of that photo documentation as well for the site. Okay, did it stop working? Okay. With respect to Section 106, we don't anticipate any impact on archaeological resources due to all the previous work that was done at the site. But as I indicated, we will be adhering to the U.S. Army Garrison Alaska's procedures in the event that we do identify an archaeological site during our activities. Any questions on Section 106, the historical mitigation? No. Okay. So we will move to our last topic for the evening, public involvement. So project stakeholders, the Army is committed to transparently sharing accurate information in a timely manner throughout the project with all of our stakeholders to ensure that information is coordinated and stakeholder concerns are fully addressed. So some of our key stakeholders are regulators, obviously our property owner, Fort Greely, and the tenants, state and federal officials, public interest groups, local and tribal officials, and then any other government agencies. So with respect to stakeholder engagement, we are consulting with multiple regulatory agencies to include, but not limited to, the Environmental Protection Agency, Region 10, Alaska Department of Natural Resources, the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation, and the State Office of History and Archaeology, which is the State Historic Preservation Office. We are also consulting with the federally recognized Alaskan Native tribes in accordance with DoD Instruction 4710.02, which dictates our interactions with federally recognized tribes. So the public review period opened on the 26th of February when we released the draft EA, and it will run through March 28th, sorry. That is a 30-day public comment period. If you would like an extension, you do need to request that, and we can grant up to a 15-day extension in order to facilitate additional review time. During this review time, you're also allowed to participate in and comment on any Section 106 information from a historical preservation perspective. Ways to comment. Comments may be submitted during the review period here tonight at the in-person meeting, so there are some comment forms on the table. You can do comments by email, and you can also submit comments by U.S. Postal Service mail. All comments have to be postmarked or received no later than the 28th of March. Substantial comments and agency feedback received on the draft EA will be addressed in the final EA, which again we anticipate for the summer of 2021. And email and postal addresses are going to be provided on the later slides. And so again, we really encourage you to participate in this process and provide your comments and feedback so we can take that into account as we finish the EA for this site. Any questions on the public involvement? Okay. So we're going to move into some questions and final discussions. So engaging and learning more, we do have a robust project website, and so that website is available for you here. If you go to that website, there is a sign up for our stakeholder updates. So there's a form on there that you can sign up and receive updates from me. I do that monthly. Sometimes more frequently, especially when we have a lot of things going on at the site. We also have social media, so we have Facebook, we have Twitter, and then our Baltimore District website is there as well. And so these slides and all of the draft environmental assessment information are available on our public website, and we'll be posting these slides to the website. And it'll also direct you to we've set up a virtual public meeting room, so everything that you see on the posters behind you and this slide presentation, all the draft EA documentation is also in that virtual public meeting room. And so you can walk through that room at your leisure. You can look at the materials again. It provides an opportunity for you to comment in that room as well. And so that's another way that you can provide feedback and participate in the process. So copies of the draft EA are available here tonight if you would like to take a hard copy with you. They are also available electronically on our project website and in that virtual public meeting room. We've also provided print copies of the draft environmental assessment and the draft finding of no significant impact to local libraries here in Delta. The Noel Wine Public Library in Fairbanks, and the USACE Library in Anchorage, and the Fort Wainwright Library. And I understand some of these libraries are closed due to COVID, but some do have checkout, and you can pick them up curbside. So those are other opportunities to gain access to the documentation during the public comment period. So again, ways to comment. We do have an established email address, and so the email address that you see here and in all the forms and documentation comes directly to my team. You can comment here tonight in the public meeting forum, or you can send written comments by U.S. Postal Mail, care of the SM-1A project to my attention, to our contractor AECom in Anchorage, and they will collect those comments that are submitted by mail so that we can respond to them in that format. And that is it. So does anyone else have any questions or comments? Go ahead.
What I was going to ask is, you said that you're using the no-action alternative as a baseline. Is there a clear chart or something easy to see the comparison of cost and risk analysis from the no-action to your plan?
So I don't have the costs included in the environmental assessment because we are in active procurement, and that would obviously impact our procurement process, but there is a table in the environmental assessment that details all the alternatives considered and the various criteria that we use to screen them and look at them. And so that is in there, and risk is a key one, safety and health is a key one. Cost is a screening criteria, but I don't give the cost of the project per se.
What about the cost of no action?
The cost of no action. So the cost of no action would continue to be Costs for my project team, the ongoing monitoring at the site, which we come to Fort Greely once a year. We have a radiological dosimetry at the site that we exchange on an annual basis. We do structural inspections yearly, and then we do have ongoing repairs and maintenance at the site. And so there are starting to be structural concerns with the site. We've had to do some extensive repairs to the spent fuel pit, and we've had to replace the roof several times, and the structure is beginning to have some wear and tear. And so those costs would continue to rise, and we would need to continue to do those.
In the final EA, will you publish the expected costs compared to the no action costs?
No.
You won't share that?
No. Stephen?
Sounds like you can't answer my question. I was going to ask the rough order of magnitude of a project like this.
I can't answer that question, I'm sorry. I can tell you that the sister plant was just awarded for $71.2 million. So,
Maybe you had 200 or 300 yourself, so I think you have a range in there.
Available for Alaska.
How much of that would go to the local community? Do you have any?
so we looked at the travel and per diem costs, and they are a good portion of the cost here. Because of the remote location, we plan to incentivize anybody who comes to work on this project, and so there will be incentives given to come work on this project. We haven't fully detailed that plan yet because we're still working through that, and we're going to be soliciting input from the contracting community. But we plan to incentivize because we know this is a rough place for people to come and live and work for 6 years if they're not used to it. And so that's what we plan to do. I'm being honest. This is the third one. So
71 million was one of them, and what was the other one?
the other one was 70.2 million. So the first one was a mobile reactor. It was on the Sturgis, which was a former Liberty ship. And so that work was done in Galveston and Brownsville, Texas. The sister plant to this facility, actually the first reactor that the DoD built was the SM-1, which is located at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. And then this is the third facility that the Army has to be decommissioned. They have one active reactor, which is at White Sands. And so that's still in operation.
In Virginia, did they grout it in?
No, so the key difference between the one in Virginia and the one here are two things. Number one, the Virginia facility is a standalone facility, so it is not part of any heating or power or utility system for the installation at Fort Belvoir. And two, that vapor containment structure was not encased and grouted in any way. So we can immediately access all the components without having to do the work to get through the encasement materials. So those are the two big differences between the reactor sites.
So geography and decommissioning method are going to make it quite a bit more than 70 million.
Yeah, but as I indicated, we plan to learn a lot as we do the first land-based one, and because we have full access to the vapor containment structure there, our hope, and we talked to the fire chief yesterday, and sir, hopefully you'll support it, is I want to take some people TDY down there to look at what we plan to do down there so that everybody can learn from what we're doing at SM-1. And then obviously geography is a huge component, quite different geographies from Belvoir, Virginia to Fort Greely, Alaska. Yeah, but transport from Fort Belvoir will be by rail, so we will truck off the installation there as well. We'll go to a local rail yard in Lorton, Virginia, and then it will go across country on rail as well.
So is there any plans to bring back nuclear energy at all? Like, is that not you or?
No, it is me. Well, maybe in the future. The Army does have 2 companies looking at prototype reactors right now. And so there is a strong interest in bringing reactors back online. Fortunate or unfortunate, all of the installations in Alaska have the highest utility rates. for the entire DoD. And so bringing back nuclear power would benefit the DoD from a utility perspective.
Would there be any advantage to using that site?
That makes it more amenable for Fort Greely to apply for a reactor, but I cannot speak to what the installation plans to do.
And if they did bring one back, would they share that, would they connect that to the community as well?
That I can't speak to, but I can tell you that right now the heating plant can backfeed Wainwright, and so I would suspect that that could be a huge benefit to the community, but I would not be able to give you that answer here tonight. Any other questions, concerns, comments? Okay, so I do want to thank everyone for coming out this evening. This is a very important project for the Corps and for the Army. And so again, we really want your input on the process. We want your feedback so that when we finalize the document, everyone's had an opportunity to provide their feedback. We do have posters in the back, so if you want to stick around and speak with any of our teammates, we will be here to do that with you. And we look forward to your feedback on the process. So thank you, everyone.